Aktion T4 was a state-run program of involuntary euthanasia in Nazi Germany, targeting people with physical and mental disabilities. It stemmed from early 20th century eugenic beliefs that certain traits and behaviors were hereditary and undesirable. Before Nazi rule, countries like the United States, Canada, Denmark, and Switzerland had already introduced sterilization laws, but Germany had been slower to adopt them. This changed in 1933 when a specific law enforced compulsory sterilization for those with conditions like schizophrenia or epilepsy. Hitler's personal doctor Karl Brandt and Reichschancellery head Hans Lammers later testified that Hitler had wanted to extend this policy to killing the incurably ill, but initially held back due to public opinion. The first known trial case came in 1939, when Hitler authorized the euthanasia of an infant named Gerhard Kretschmer, who had severe disabilities, after his parents requested that his life be taken. Officially launched in late 1939, Aktion T4 authorized doctors to identify patients deemed unfit for life or incurably sick and grant them a so-called mercy death. Victims were murdered in 6 main centers, including Hadamar and Hartheim psychiatric hospitals, through gassing and lethal injections. Families were sent falsified death certificates to conceal the crimes. As the Third Reich expanded its territory, the scope of T4 also grew, including German adults with hereditary illnesses, and the program quickly spread to Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, involving the SS. Eventually, the war effort led to a need for hospital beds, and regional leaders sought to free up room by getting rid of disabled patients. Although public protests from Christian leaders like Bishop Clemens von Galen forced an official end to T4 in 1941, the program continued secretly until 1945. An estimated 300,000 people were killed under Aktion T4. The campaign was driven by Nazi ideas of racial hygiene, economic motives, and the belief that disabled lives were unworthy. Key figures such as Karl Brandt were later tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. The Babi Yar Massacre was one of the largest mass shootings of World War II, carried out by Nazi forces shortly after occupying Kiev in September 1941. After an explosion near the city rocked Rear Headquarters Army Group South, caused by explosives left behind by the Soviet NKVD, Major General Kurt Eberhard, SS leader Friedrich Jeckeln, and Einsatzgruppe commanders Otto Rasch and Paul Blobel decided to exterminate Kiev's Jewish population as supposed retaliation. Einsatzgruppe C, assisted by local Ukrainian police collaborators, was tasked with carrying out the massacre. On September 27th, the Jews of Kiev were ordered to gather for what they were told would be deportation. Many complied, unaware of the Nazi plan, as Soviet authorities had previously censored reports of Nazi atrocities to maintain relations. Over 30,000 Jews assembled at the meeting point and were taken to a ravine named Babi Yar. In groups of 100, they were led into the ravine, where they were shot. The process, known as sardine packing, involved forcing victims to lie atop the bodies of those already shot, leaving some buried alive. The massacre lasted 2 days. Babi Yar continued to serve as an execution site. In total, over 100,000 people were murdered there during the German occupation. As the war turned against Germany, the Nazis sought to erase evidence of their crimes. Under SS officer Paul Blobel, a special operation known as Sonderaktion 1005 exhumed and burned the bodies. The Lidice Massacre was carried out in response to the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking SS general, police chief, and Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Heydrich was attacked on May 27, 1942 by Czech and Slovak partisans sent by the Czechoslovak government in exile, and died of his wounds on June 4th. Within days, Hitler ordered that villages suspected of aiding the assassins be annihilated as collective punishment. On June 9, 1942, following these orders, SS-Gruppenführer Karl Hermann Frank and security police chief Horst Böhme targeted the small Czech village Lidice. The choice was based on a mistaken connection uncovered through a love letter intercepted by the Gestapo, which falsely linked Lidice residents to Heydrich's attackers. That evening, Nazi police surrounded the village, blocking all escape routes. At dawn on June 10th, all males aged 15 and over were gathered at their local farm and and executed by firing squad. Over 200 women were deported to concentration camps, and most children were taken from their mothers. 9 children deemed suitable for Germanization were sent to live with SS families, while the majority were taken to the Chelmno extermination camp and gassed. The village itself was set ablaze, its ruins blown up, and all animals slaughtered. 2 weeks later, the nearby village of Ležáky suffered the same fate after the Gestapo discovered a hidden radio transmitter linked to the resistance. All 33 adults were executed. In total, over 1,300 people were killed in reprisals related to Heydrich's assassination. Operation Reinhard was the codename for the Nazi plan to exterminate Polish Jews in occupied Poland in a very short time period. The operation established 3 purpose-built extermination camps: Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, designed solely for mass murder, unlike Auschwitz and Majdanek, which initially focused on forced labor before adding gas chambers. The operation was directly overseen by SS and police leader Odilo Grobotnik, who received orders from Heinrich Himmler in October 1941 to begin constructing the first camp at Belzec. Each camp was managed by 20 to 35 officers from the SS Totenkopfverbände and supplemented by personnel experienced in Aktion T4 euthanasia killings. The camps were strategically located near Jewish ghettos and railways for efficient logistics. Prisoners arriving at the camps were deceived with facilities resembling reception areas, including barber shops and money depositories, before being led along the so-called road to heaven into sealed gas chambers. Victims were killed using carbon monoxide from internal combustion engines. Ukrainian guards recruited from Soviet prisoners of war performed much of the camp labor under SS supervision. Beginning in early 1943, bodies were exhumed and cremated to hide evidence of mass killings. In total, Operation Reinhard resulted in the deaths of over 2 million Jews. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943 was a desperate act of Jewish resistance against Nazi deportations and extermination. After the Großaktion Warsaw in the summer of 1942, which sent over 250,000 Jews from the ghetto to Treblinka, the remaining residents began building bunkers and smuggling weapons. The uprising began on April 19th, when the ghetto refused to surrender to SS Brigadeführer Jürgen Stroop. Initial German progress was slow, prompting Himmler to order the operation to continue with greater harshness and relentless severity. Stroop responded by systematically burning the ghetto, block by block, using flamethrowers and explosives to destroy bunkers, cellars, and sewers. By the end, nearly the entire ghetto was destroyed. Only 8 buildings were spared. Around 13,000 Jews lost their lives during the uprising, many burned alive or suffocated in sealed buildings. Around 50,000 were captured and deported, mostly to Treblinka and Majdanek, where they were murdered on arrival. Afterward, the ruins were razed and a Warsaw concentration camp was established. The Oradour-sur-Glane Massacre took place on June 10, 1944, when 642 French civilians, including over 200 children, were murdered by soldiers of the 2nd SS Panzerdivision Das Reich in Nazi-occupied France. The division had been ordered to move north toward Normandy after the Allied D-Day landings, but it was delayed by sabotage and resistance attacks. On June 9th, Das Reich troops executed 99 men in the nearby town of Tulle and learned that a German officer, Sturmbannführer Helmut Kempfe, had been captured and killed by the French resistance. Acting on false information that Kempfe had been burned alive, his friend and fellow officer Adolf Diekmann led his battalion to the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in retribution. When the SS troops arrived, they surrounded the village and gathered all residents. Men were taken to barns, where they were shot in the legs before the buildings were set on fire. Women and children were locked inside the church, which was then set ablaze. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned. By the end of the day, nearly every person in the village was dead. The entire village was burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Although Diekmann was accused of exceeding his orders, the investigation into his actions ended after he was killed in Normandy shortly afterward. In 1953, a trial in Bordeaux convicted 20 former SS soldiers for their roles in the massacre, but most sentences were later reduced. Later, SS officer Heinz Barth was tried in East Germany and sentenced to life imprisonment after admitting he was involved. The Malmedy Massacre occurred on December 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, when soldiers of the Waffen-SS executed American prisoners of war in Belgium. Around midday, a German armored unit led by SS officer Joachim Peiper encountered a US convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion at a crossroads. After a brief skirmish, the Germans destroyed the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the convoy. Outnumbered and unable to fight back, the American soldiers surrendered. Over 100 US soldiers were gathered in a nearby field. Then, SS troops opened fire with machine guns, killing 84. Survivors who tried to flee were shot, and many wounded were executed with close-range gunshots. Some men escaped to a nearby cafe, but the SS troops set the building on fire and killed those who ran out. Responsibility for the massacre remains disputed. Peiper himself had already left the area, but Commander Werner Pötschke is believed to have ordered it. The Rumbula Massacre took place near Riga, Latvia on November 30th and December 8th, 1941, when around 25,000 Jews were executed by Nazi forces and Latvian collaborators. After the German occupation of Latvia, SS Commander Friedrich Jeckeln and Einsatzgruppe A under General Franz-Walter Stahlecker began systematically murdering Jewish communities. Jeckeln worked with local auxiliaries, including the Arats Kommando led by Viktors Arais, to carry out the operation. Under the false promise of resettlement, thousands of Jews from Riga Ghetto were forced to march to the Rumbula forest. Those who fell behind were shot on the spot. At the site, victims were stripped of clothing and valuables, forced to lie face down in trenches, and shot in layers. Many were buried alive as the mass graves were covered. Children, elderly, and disabled people were all among the victims. Afterward, the Germans exhumed and burned the bodies to erase evidence. Jeckeln, Eduard Strauch, and Rudolf Lange, who oversaw the operation, were later captured or executed. Latvian collaborators like Arais were eventually tried, while Herbert Cukurs was killed by Israeli agents decades later. The Hunger Plan was a Nazi policy devised before the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, intended to sustain German troops and civilians by systematically seizing food from occupied Soviet territories and deliberately starving millions of their inhabitants. Conceived by Hermann Göring, Reich Minister Richard Darry, and State Secretary Herbert Backe, the plan was adopted in April 1941 as a blueprint for using the agricultural resources of the Soviet Union, especially Ukraine, to make Germany self-sufficient and to fuel its war effort. By confiscating grain and livestock, the policy aimed to eliminate what Nazi planners called useless eaters through starvation. During the implementation of Operation Barbarossa, food stocks were sent from the Soviet Union to Germany, creating widespread famine across occupied regions. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war and Jewish civilians were deliberately left without food. While the full scope of the plan could not be realized due to the failure of the German advance and growing logistical problems, it still resulted in the deaths of approximately 4.2 million people between 1941 and 44. Medical experiments. Between 1939 and 45, Nazi doctors carried out brutal experiments on concentration camp prisoners under the guise of scientific research to aid the German military. At Dachau and Auschwitz, freezing and high-altitude tests led by Sigmund Rascher and Ernst Holzlöhner exposed prisoners to near-death conditions to study hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. Many froze to death or suffered brain damage, while others were killed in pressure chambers that simulated extreme altitudes. Rascher also shot or cut prisoners to test blood-clotting agents. Hans Eppinger and Wilhelm Beigelböck forced Roma prisoners at Dachau to survive only on seawater to test desalination methods, leaving most dead. Disease trials infected inmates with malaria, typhus, and tetanus to test new drugs, often ending in mass death. Chemical and poison experiments used mustard gas, nerve agents, and phosphorus to study burns and antidotes, with thousands dying from slow suffocation or chemical poisoning. Josef Mengeles' twin experiments at Auschwitz were among the most infamous. Children were mutilated or infected to study genetics, while other trials explored forced sterilization. Transplantation experiments by Karl Gebhardt involved removing or grafting limbs and tissues from living victims. The Holocaust was the systematic genocide of Europe's Jewish population during World War II. Between 1941 and 45, Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered around 6 million Jews through mass shootings and gas chambers in extermination camps. Nazi persecution began years earlier with anti-Jewish laws, forced segregation, and violent attacks like Kristallnacht in 1938. Jews were stripped of rights, property and citizenship and confined to ghettos after Germany invaded Poland. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, mobile killing units murdered up to 2 million Jews across Eastern Europe. By 1942, Nazi leaders decided on the final solution, a plan to exterminate every Jew in Europe through deportation to death camps, where most were gassed on arrival or died from starvation, disease and abuse. Hitler viewed the destruction of the Jews as central to his ideology, blaming them for capitalism, communism and debauchery. Even as Germany lost the war, resources were diverted to continue mass extermination.